blood on fine Italian linen changes a man. When the most feared boss in Chicago's underworld watched a terrified, fiercely beautiful woman take a brutal punch in his own dining room, the city's criminal landscape shifted forever. He didn't care about the rules. He only wanted her. The chandeliers at Gabbiano's cast a golden, buttery glow over the Chicago elite, illuminating a room where fortunes were quietly traded over plates of truffle risotto and bottles of Barolo. Nestled in a velvet-lined corner booth, Stella Hayes felt entirely invisible, despite taking up more space than the rail-thin socialites floating through the dining room. Stella was a woman of lush, heavy curves. She had thick thighs that pressed tightly against the dark fabric of her dress, a soft, full stomach she spent most of her life trying to hide, and a generous bust that drew eyes she usually wished to avoid. For years she had been made to feel like a burden, an apology in physical form, and the man sitting across from her was the primary architect of that insecurity. Damian Brooks swirled his scotch, his handsome face twisted into a sneer that had become horribly familiar to her. "I don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this, Stella," Damian hissed, keeping his voice dangerously low so as not to disturb the neighboring tables. "It's a simple wire transfer. You manage the accounts at the firm. Nobody looks at the discretionary fund twice." Stella's hands trembled in her lap, her knuckles white as she gripped her napkin. "It's embezzlement, Damian. I'm an accountant, not a thief. I could go to prison." Damian slammed his glass onto the table, the sharp clack making her flinch. "You think I want to be asking you for this? I am in a hole, Stella. A massive hole. And if I don't get 50 grand by tomorrow night, they are going to break my legs. Then go to the police," she whispered fiercely, tears pricking her eyes. "Or tell your parents I am not ruining my life because you couldn't stay away from the underground poker tables." Damian's eyes darkened, a predatory, ugly light flashing in them. He leaned across the table, invading her space, his breath smelling of expensive liquor and bitter desperation. "You owe me," he spat. "Look at you, Stella. Look at yourself. You're fat, you're pathetic, and you're lucky I even take you out to a place like this. Who else is going to love a bloated cow like you? You do this for me, or I swear to God." "No." Stella said the word, slipping out before she could stop it. Her voice shook, but the refusal was firm. "I'm done, Damian. I'm not doing it." The slap was so sudden, so vicious that Stella didn't even see his hand move. The sound of flesh striking flesh cracked through the quiet hum of the restaurant corner like a gunshot. The force of Damian's backhand whipped Stella's head to the side. Her cheekbone collided with the edge of her crystal water glass, shattering it. Water and blood spilled onto the pristine white tablecloth. Stella gasped a breathless sound of shock and agony, clutching her bleeding face. The world spun in a dizzying blur. She tasted copper. A few patrons nearby gasped, but in a place frequented by powerful, dangerous men, people knew when to look away. Damian breathed heavily, his fists clenched, already preparing to grab her arm and drag her out before management arrived. "Look what you made me do," he snarled. "Get up, we're leaving." But they were not leaving. High above the dining room floor, concealed behind the one-way glass of the VIP mezzanine, Lorenzo Moretti stood perfectly still. Lorenzo was a man carved from Sicilian marble and Chicago steel. At 35, he was the undisputed head of the Moretti Syndicate, a man whose quietest whispers carried more weight than a politician's scream. He was elegantly dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit. His dark hair immaculately styled his jaw sharp and dusted with a shadow of stubble. He had been reviewing the week's laundering reports, watching his restaurant hum with life, until his dark, predatory eyes locked onto the corner booth. He had watched the couple for the past 10 minutes. He had noticed the woman first. She was breathtaking. Lorenzo had always harbored a quiet, intense preference for women with actual substance, women with lush, heavy figures, soft curves and skin that looked like it yielded to a man's touch. The woman in the booth was gorgeous, her thick, dark red hair tumbling over soft, pale shoulders. But her body language was all wrong. She was hunched over, making herself small, shrinking away from the ferret-faced man sitting across from her. Then Lorenzo watched the man strike her. He saw her head snap back. He saw the crystal shatter. He saw the drop of bright crimson hit his pristine linen. A heavy, terrifying silence fell over the mezzanine. Behind Lorenzo, his right-hand man, Vincent Vinny Giordano, stopped breathing. Vinny had known Lorenzo since they were boys bleeding on the streets of the West Side. Vinny knew what that dead glacial look in Lorenzo's eyes meant. Lorenzo didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply reached out and pressed the intercom button that connected to the earpieces of his floor security, the man in booth 4. Lorenzo's voice was a low, gravelly baritone that sent a shiver down the spine of anyone who heard it. "Break his hands!" And the woman... Lorenzo paused, his dark eyes tracking Stella as she sobbed into her hands, blood dripping through her fingers. A strange, fierce possessiveness ignited in his chest, a dark, consuming fire that he hadn't felt in a decade. "Bring her to me." Down on the dining floor, Damien reached out to grab Stella's wrist. "I said, get up, you stupid bee." A hand the size of a dinner plate clamped down on Damien's shoulder. The grip was so punishingly tight that Damien let out a strangled yelp, sinking back into the leather booth. "Excuse me, sir," a voice rumbled. Damien looked up, the color draining instantly from his face. Surrounding their table were 3 men in perfectly tailored dark suits. They didn't look like bouncers. They looked like executioners. At the head of the trio was Vinny, his broad shoulders blocking out the light of the chandelier. "Is there a problem here?" Damien stammered, his bravado vanishing, replaced by the cowardly sweat of a man who suddenly realized he was out of his depth. "You broke a glass," Vinny said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I'll pay for it." Damien rushed out, reaching for his wallet. "It was an accident. My girlfriend, just clumsy." Vinny didn't let him finish. He grabbed Damien by the lapels of his suit, hauling him over the table with terrifying ease. Silverware clattered, plates crashed to the floor. Damien kicked and thrashed, but 2 other enforcers immediately seized his arms, twisting them behind his back with an audible pop of a dislocated shoulder. Damien screamed, but one of the men clamped a gloved hand over his mouth, muffling the sound. "Take him to the basement," Vinny instructed quietly. The boss gave specific instructions about his hands. Stella sat frozen in terror, the blood from her cheek dripping onto her collarbone. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. Her abusive boyfriend was being dragged backward through a concealed service door by men who looked like ghosts. Vinny turned his attention to her. His hard, scarred face softened a fraction. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a clean white silk handkerchief, offering it to her. "Press this to your cheek, miss," Vinny said gently. Stella took it with trembling fingers, pressing it to the cut. "Well, what are you doing to him? Who are you?" She stammered, tears streaming down her plump, flushed cheeks. "We are simply handling a disturbance," Vinny replied smoothly. "However, the owner of this establishment would like to make sure you are all right. If you would please come with me." I just want to go home," Stella whispered, hugging her thick arms around her heavy torso, feeling painfully exposed. "I insist," Vinny said. It wasn't a request. Guided by a mixture of shock and sheer self-preservation, Stella stood up. Her legs felt like lead. She followed Vinny through the dining room, ignoring the curious stares of the wealthy patrons. They walked through a discreet door near the wine cellar, stepping into a private, lavishly carpeted hallway and ascended a winding staircase. They reached a set of heavy carved mahogany doors. Vinny opened them and gestured for her to step inside. Stella walked into the room, and the breath caught in her throat. The office was cavernous, smelling of rich leather, expensive bourbon, and cedarwood. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering Chicago skyline. In the center of the room sat a massive desk, and leaning against it, pouring a glass of amber liquid, was the most intimidatingly handsome man Stella had ever seen. Lorenzo Moretti set the decanter down. He picked up the 2 crystal glasses and walked slowly toward her. He moved like a predator, silent, deliberate, radiating an overwhelming aura of power. "Sit," Lorenzo commanded softly, nodding toward a plush leather sofa. Stella obeyed, sinking into the deep cushions. Her ample thighs spread slightly, and she immediately tried to tug the hem of her dress down to cover her knees, a nervous habit born from years of Damien's cruel remarks. Lorenzo noticed the gesture. His eyes tracked the movement, lingering on her thick, beautiful thighs, before moving up over the soft swell of her stomach to the heavy rise and fall of her chest. There was no disgust in his gaze, only a dark, simmering appreciation that made Stella's skin flush with heat. He handed her a glass of bourbon. "Drink. It will help with the shock." She took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm and calloused. She took a sip, the liquor burning a pleasant trail down her throat. Lorenzo sat on the heavy oak coffee table directly in front of her, their knees mere inches apart. He reached out his large hand, incredibly gentle, as he peeled the blood-soaked handkerchief away from her cheek. He inspected the cut, his jaw tightening. "A beautiful face like yours should never wear a bruise," Lorenzo said, his voice a low rumble. "Who is he to you?" My boyfriend," Stella whispered, mesmerized by the sheer intensity of the man before her. "Damien Brooks. Please, what are your men doing to him?" Lorenzo chuckled a dark, humorless sound. "Damien Brooks. I know that name. He is currently learning a very painful lesson about respect in my basement. And soon he will learn a lesson about debt." Stella's stomach plummeted. "Debt." Lorenzo leaned back, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Your boyfriend is a degenerate gambler, Miss Hayes. Stella Hayes." "Stella." Lorenzo rolled the name over his tongue as if tasting it. "Beautiful. Tell me, Stella, did you know that Damien owes my associates $250,000? Stella gasped, all the color draining from her face. $250,000. He told me he needed 50. He was trying to buy himself a few more days," Lorenzo explained coldly. "But that is not the interesting part. The interesting part, Stella, is the collateral he used to secure that line of credit." Lorenzo reached behind him to his desk, picking up a manila folder. He tossed it onto the coffee table. The folder fell open, revealing a stack of financial documents. Stella leaned forward, her eyes scanning the pages. Her blood ran cold. These are the ledgers for my accounting firm," she breathed in horror. "And this is my signature on a guarantor form." She looked up, panic seizing her chest. "I didn't sign this. He forged my signature. He stole my security pass to get these ledgers." "I figured as much," Lorenzo said calmly. "A woman with your intelligence wouldn't be foolish enough to guarantee the debt of a rat like Brooks. But in the eyes of my world, this paperwork means you are responsible for his debt. It means, Stella, that you belong to me." Stella's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the incredibly powerful, dangerous man sitting in front of her. She was a plus-size, quiet accountant from the suburbs. She had no money, no power. She was utterly ruined. Tears spilled over her lashes. "Please," she choked out. "I don't have that kind of money. I don't have anything. I'm nobody." Lorenzo moved suddenly. He shifted forward, trapping her between his knees, his large hands reaching out to cup her soft, tear-stained face. His thumbs gently wiped away her tears, his touch completely at odds with the violent world he commanded. "You are not nobody," Lorenzo said fiercely, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a burning intensity. "I watched him belittle you. I saw how you try to hide yourself, Stella. You hide your body. You hide your brilliance. But I see you." Stella stopped breathing. The way he looked at her, it wasn't just protective. It was hungry. It was possessive. "I don't want your money, Stella." Lorenzo whispered, his face inches from hers, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "Damian Brooks is a dead man, walking. His debt is his own. But his mistake—" Lorenzo's thumb brushed over her swollen lower lip. "Brought you into my house. And now that you are here, I am not letting you go." The twist of fate was dizzying. An hour ago, Stella thought her biggest problem was surviving another night with an abusive loser. Now she was sitting in the private office of a mafia kingpin, heavily in debt on paper, yet being looked at like she was the most precious, desirable creature on earth. "What do you want from me?" she breathed, trembling, as the warmth of his hands seeped into her skin. Lorenzo smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips that promised both ruin and salvation. "Everything," he replied. "I need an accountant who knows how to clean up a mess, and I want a woman who knows her worth. Work for me, Stella. Stay under my protection. I will clear the debt, I will make Brooks disappear, and I will show you exactly how a woman like you is supposed to be treated." He stood up, offering her his hand. "So, Stella Hayes, do we have a deal?" Stella stared at the massive, calloused hand offered to her. It was the hand of a killer, a criminal, a man who ruled Chicago's shadows with absolute ruthlessness. Yet it was the only hand that had ever been extended to her with genuine respect. Damian had only ever grabbed her to pull her down. Lorenzo Moretti was offering to pull her up. Taking a deep, ragged breath that filled her heavy chest, she placed her trembling fingers into his warm palm. His grip closed around her hand, solid and unyielding, sealing her fate. "I have a deal." Stella whispered the words, trembling but resolute. The transition into Lorenzo's world was swift and entirely overwhelming. Stella did not return to the cramped, miserable apartment she had shared with Damian. She was driven in the back of a heavily armored black sedan to a sprawling, high-security estate in the exclusive enclave of Lake Forest. The gates swung open to reveal a mansion of pale stone surrounded by ancient oaks and iron fences. It was a fortress. For the first few days, Stella lived in a state of surreal suspension. She was given a massive suite overlooking Lake Michigan, attended to by a warm, fiercely protective housekeeper named Rosa, who fed her rich, homemade pasta and refused to let Stella skip a single meal. But the most profound shock came on her third morning. Stella opened the doors to her walk-in closet and found it filled entirely with new clothing. There were no oversized, shapeless sweaters. There were no dark, baggy trousers designed to hide her body. Instead, the racks were lined with exquisite, custom-tailored silk dresses, cashmere wrap coats, and sharply cut business suits in deep emeralds, burgundies, and sapphire blues. Every single garment had been meticulously selected to fit her exact measurements. Rosa stood in the doorway, beaming. Mr. Moretti had a private tailor bring these in. He gave very strict instructions. He said you were to wear fabrics that honor your shape, not hide it. Stella touched a deep emerald silk dress, tears pricking her eyes. For her entire life, her fatness had been treated as a moral failing, a grotesque error she needed to apologize for by wearing tents of dull fabric. But Lorenzo had looked at her thick thighs, her full stomach, and her heavy breasts, and decided she deserved to be draped in royalty. When Stella finally descended the grand staircase, later that morning, wearing a tailored navy blue pencil skirt that hugged her wide hips and a crisp white blouse that accentuated her ample cleavage, the mansion went utterly silent. Lorenzo stood in the grand foyer, speaking quietly with Vinny. When Lorenzo looked up and saw her, the conversation died on his lips. His dark eyes darkened further, dropping slowly down her curves before returning to her flushed face. The raw, unfiltered hunger in his gaze made Stella's knees weak. "You look breathtaking, Stella," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping an octave, rumbling through the quiet hall. "Are you ready to see my books?" "I am," she replied, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. Lorenzo led her into his private study, a room lined with leather-bound books and secured servers. He granted her access to the financial records of his legitimate front business's construction firms, shipping companies, and real estate holdings. For the next 3 weeks, Stella poured her soul into the numbers. The ledgers were a tangled, chaotic mess of dummy corporations and offshore accounts. It was an accountant's worst nightmare, but to Stella, it was a beautiful puzzle. She worked late into the nights, her brilliant mind finding patterns in the chaos. Lorenzo often sat in the leather armchair across the room, drinking bourbon and simply watching her. He never interrupted. He just watched her with that same intense, possessive gaze, admiring her intellect as much as her lush body. It was on a rainy Tuesday evening that Stella found the discrepancy. She was cross-referencing the payroll accounts for a commercial shipping warehouse on the south side when the numbers snagged. It was incredibly subtle, a fractional skimming operation hidden within overtime payouts and inflated fuel costs. Whoever was doing it was a genius bleeding the Moretti syndicate of hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 2 years without triggering a single alarm. Stella's heart hammered against her ribs. She printed the routing numbers, her plump fingers flying across the keyboard to trace the dummy accounts. The money wasn't going to a rival family. It was being funneled into a private shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. A shell company that, after hours of relentless digging, Stella managed to link to a Chicago address. She gathered the files, her thick thighs trembling as she stood up. She rushed out of the study and found Lorenzo in the billiards room, smoking a cigar with Vinny and a prominent syndicate captain named Dominic. "Lorenzo," Stella said, interrupting the low murmur of the men. She clutched the folders to her heavy chest, suddenly hyper-aware of the dangerous men staring at her. Lorenzo immediately crushed his cigar into a glass ashtray, his entire demeanor shifting. He crossed the room, completely ignoring his underbosses, and placed a gentle hand on her lower back. "What is it, Mia Cara? You look pale." "We need to talk, in private," she insisted, her voice tight with anxiety. Lorenzo nodded. He led her back into the study, locking the heavy mahogany doors behind them. Stella spread the documents across his desk, her manicured finger pointing to the highlighted anomalies. "Someone is stealing from you, Lorenzo," Stella explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's a micro-skimming operation on the Southside shipping docks. They've been inflating operational costs and routing the excess into a ghost account. Over the last 24 months, they've bled nearly $2 million from the syndicate." Lorenzo's expression turned lethal. He leaned over the desk, his broad shoulders casting a terrifying shadow. He reviewed the routing numbers, his brilliant, violent mind instantly understanding the data she had uncovered. "Who?" Lorenzo asked, his voice deadly quiet. Stella swallowed hard. "The Cayman account traces back to a holding firm. The firm is registered to your captain, Dominic." A suffocating silence filled the room. Dominic was one of Lorenzo's oldest friends, a man who had fought beside him in the street wars a decade ago. Discovering this betrayal was a massive seismic shift in the syndicate's power structure. Lorenzo stood perfectly still, the betrayal settling over him like a shroud of ice. He slowly looked up from the papers, his dark eyes locking on to Stella. The cold fury in his gaze melted into something else entirely. It was absolute blinding reverence. My accountants have audited these books 5 times in the last 2 years, Lorenzo murmured, stepping around the desk until he was standing mere inches from her. None of them found this. But you did. They were looking at the bottom line. Stella breathed, staring up at his handsome, rugged face. I looked at the margins. That's where the truth always hides. Lorenzo reached out his large hands, resting on her wide hips. He pulled her flush against his solid body. Stella gasped, her soft, heavy stomach pressing against his rigid muscles. He dipped his head, his lips hovering a fraction of an inch from hers. "You are magnificent," he whispered fiercely against her mouth. "You are the smartest, most beautiful creature I have ever known. And you just saved my empire." He kissed her. It was a kiss of absolute possession, consuming and hungry. Stella melted into his embrace, her thick arms wrapping around his broad neck, finally understanding that in this dangerous world, her brilliant mind and her soft body were not liabilities. They were her absolute power. The execution of a syndicate captain was never a quiet affair. It required absolute precision. For 3 days, Stella worked flawlessly alongside Lorenzo and Vinny, secretly gathering the final pieces of financial evidence to freeze the hidden assets and dismantle his loyalist crew. However, cornered rats are the most dangerous. On a stormy Friday evening, Lorenzo was across the city, attending a meeting with the remaining captains. Stella remained at the Lake Forest estate. Rain lashed against the massive windows of the study as she finalized the transfer protocols to lock Dominic out of the main server. Suddenly, the mansion lost all backup power immediately. The study plunged into darkness. The only light came from the blue glow of her laptop screen. Stella froze. This was a fortress. The backup generators were very strong. They did not simply fail. A cold spike of adrenaline pierced her chest. She stood up, her heavy thighs brushing against the mahogany desk, and reached for the panic button Lorenzo had installed beneath the drawer. Before her fingers could graze the plastic, the heavy study doors swung open with a violent crash. Lightning flashed, illuminating the silhouette of a man holding a suppressed pistol. It was Dominic. Water dripped from his dark coat. The guards stationed outside were nowhere to be seen. Stella backed away, her heart hammering wildly. "Dominic," she said desperately, trying to keep her voice steady. "Lorenzo knows. He already knows everything. Killing me will not save you." "Maybe not," Dominic snarled, raising the weapon and aiming it directly at her chest. "But it will break him. He looks at you like you are a goddamn queen. A fat, pathetic accountant who ruined 2 years of my work. Lorenzo went soft the second he brought you into his bed. I am going to put a bullet in your heart, and then I am taking his throne." Her breath hitched. She was terrified, but as she stared down the barrel of the gun, she realized something profound. She was not the weak, cowering woman Damien had abused. She had dismantled a criminal enterprise with nothing but a keyboard, and she was loved by the most dangerous man in the city. She stood tall, her lush curves proudly defiant in the dim light. "You are a thief, Dominic," Stella said coldly, "and Lorenzo is going to tear you to pieces." His finger tightened on the trigger. "Goodbye, Stella." The gunshot was deafening, but the bullet did not strike Stella. Dominic screamed, his pistol flying from his hand as his right shoulder exploded in a shower of blood and bone. He collapsed to his knees, howling in agony. From the shadowed doorway of the private terrace, stepping out of the pouring rain, emerged Lorenzo. His bespoke suit was soaked his face, a mask of absolute demonic fury. He held a smoking handgun by his side. He had bypassed the front gates and scaled the terrace the moment his phone alerted him to the generator failure. Lorenzo walked slowly across the room, the terrifying silence of an apex predator closing in. Dominic clutched his shattered shoulder, sobbing, looking up at his boss in sheer terror. "Lorenzo, please!" Dominic begged, choking on his own blood. "I can explain. I can give the money back, please." Lorenzo kicked Dominic viciously in the chest, sending the traitor sprawling. He placed the heavy heel of his custom leather shoe directly over his throat. "You pointed a weapon at my woman," Lorenzo whispered. "There is no money in the world that can buy your life now." Lorenzo fired twice into the chest of the traitor. The captain lay completely dead. Lorenzo dropped his gun and grabbed Stella, pulling her heavy, gorgeous body against his soaking wet suit. "I have got you," he whispered fiercely. "I knew you would come," she sobbed. "Damien is buried in a landfill. Dominic is dead." "Your debts are erased," Lorenzo stated quietly. He looked down at her body, a gaze filled with absolute worship. "You are the mind behind my empire now. You rule beside me." Stella smiled, her heart swelling with a dark, consuming love. "I understand," she whispered. Lorenzo captured her lips, sealing everything. What will Stella choose next? She has stepped into the dark, dangerous world of the Moretti crime family and left her abusive past far behind. But is his fierce protection a golden cage or true freedom? The underworld is incredibly unforgiving, and the explosive chemistry between them will test everything. If you loved this intense mafia romance, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss another gripping real-life story.